Welcome to Holly's Pandorium, featuring your host, psychic medium Holly Jordan.
Welcome back, everybody. Hi, this is Holly from Holly's Pandorium, and Doug Cox is here with me. And Doug is definitely, I'm going to pause this, Doug. Hold on. So a little bit of technical difficulties. This is Doug Cox.
Hello.
And we're glad to meet with everyone again today. And we have something interesting that we're going to share. A while back, I did a couple of things that talked about different vampire stories. Okay, so we're going to talk about something interesting here. I talked about a woman that bathed in virgin's blood, and she murdered over 600 virgins, they estimated, during her lifetime. And she was considered the Countess Dracula. Her name was Elizabeth. She was very wealthy in her day and age, and there was accusations that she actually drank the blood of some of these virgins. And we had a little more research come through, and it looks like even her staff was murdered for participating in this whole thing. But also there was a lot of speculation about whether she actually participated in this or not. There was some information that came through that she actually was thrown into an investigation from the King of Hungary, who happened to owe her husband a lot of money. So after her husband died, this King of Hungary came to her house, to her castle rather, and did this enormous investigation and tortured her staff. And of course, under torture, they said, oh yeah, we participated, and many of them were burned at the stake. One of them was decapitated and burned at the stake. They ended up imprisoning Elizabeth in her castle for the rest of her life. But it's interesting to me because there's all these stories about vampires in different generations and different centuries. And they become more strange the more I delve into this. And I wanted to share this one story. Doug and I watched some information about it today, and it was really unsettling and amazing. So there was an investigation and a grave site that was located in, am I saying this right, Doug? Pien, Poland? I'm not saying it right. Pienia is the way it's said. And this place apparently has so many people buried in it that when it's very stormy and it rains a lot, skeletons actually roll down the hill, which is kind of scary and gross. It's not occupied even to this day in Poland. It's left alone. It's just a field.
Yeah, it's a very remote part of Poland, I guess. It's not far from Warsaw, but it's definitely outside the beaten path. In fact, they were commenting how difficult it is to get to the town.
Yeah, it's very, very remote. But what's interesting is that in the course of some investigating by some, God, I can't talk. In the course of investigating by anthropologists, they found one gravesite in particular that was very strange. It was number 75. There's over 100 graves, and I want to backtrack a little bit. The graves are layered. They've done some sonar radar scans of the hill, and it's covered. Now, this is not a cemetery. I want to make that very clear. This is not a church sanctioned or any type of hallowed ground. This is literally just a spot outside the small town that was designated for everybody that was considered a threat to their town. So anyone that they thought was a demon or a vampire or anything unusual, anyone that they considered odd or strange that may have caused harm to the town, was buried in this strange area. So in this particular area, grave site number 75 that was discovered recently, just a few years ago, this poor woman had several restraints on her. One of them was on her big toe, on her left foot. And there was actually like a padlock. It was an actual padlock on her big toe. So there was a belief in Poland, as there were many, but in the 17th century in particular, there was a vampire frenzy, they called it. And what's amazing about this is that it was believed at this time that people could have two souls at the same time. One soul would be good, one soul would be bad. And so if they put this padlock on your big toe, in your death, in your gravesite, that it would prevent your bad soul from escaping and causing harm.
Right. It seems that they divided it up very like left side and right side. That's why the lock was on the left-hand toe, which kind of feeds into the superstition that, in ancient times, left-handed people, were considered evil, those type of things. So apparently it's a matter of your left-hand soul you would take over, and hence the padlock, which they did determine that was it's not the only one that they found,
Right.
but the particular lock on this woman was very rare. It was triangle shaped, and there's only been one other one discovered in the world, I guess. So that's very
yeah. So what's interesting about these grave sites on this particular little mound or small hill, there's over 100 people buried there. 30 of them had restraints, but most of them were of another nature, which this particular gravesite number 75 also had. She had a sickle across her neck. So the anthropologists estimated that her gravesite had been disturbed at least twice, they could tell. And so part of what was done is they actually installed a sickle across her neck in the event that she would rise again from the dead, and she would literally amputate her head.
Yeah, she would literally
decapitate herself just by waking, apparently, was the idea. And eventually they did a lot of research on this particular soul, and they renamed her Zosha because it was discovered by the anthropologist that she had really been treated very badly. Her bones were actually x-rayed and put through an MRI machine, and she had cancer in her bones. She had a deformity that's apparently common in 3 to 15% of the population, where part of your bones are misshapen and it causes headaches, it causes severe pain and fainting. So this woman was not only not native to this part of Poland, she was actually a Swedish person and considered very wealthy at the time. She was odd because she was from a different place, and because she was not native born there, she was a target, and because she was wealthy. So apparently that's like the trifecta of doom for a person in that era. There was so much panic about anything different. Anytime there was bad weather, anytime there was any crop issues. And Doug, can you talk for a minute about, because I don't know if I can describe this properly, the mini ice age was happening at this time. Can you explain what that is?
So at the time of her life, there's what they call the little ice age. It's not like the Younger Dryas or anything like that, but where temperatures got really cold, and it created enough hardship, especially in the European countries, to where crops didn't grow very well. So health was bad. There was tons of malnutrition.
Right.
So, and when you start suffering from malnutrition, you get gaunt, you get thin, you get, which in a superstitious society, people would start to wonder what is wrong with this person, and then conclude that, they're a vampire or they're a demon or they're a witch or they're, when really it was starvation, and lack of nutrients.
Which is amazing. And so even in this woman's bones, in Zosha's bones, there were these lines, these horizontal lines. And the doctors that were examining her bones said that that was from stopping points in her growth through her life as a child and a young adult. So literally, she had so much malnutrition, there were times when her body would stop growing altogether.
Right.
So she had the bone cancer, she had the deformity that caused headaches and fainting and extreme pain, and she went through a period of starvation. So it was discovered in great length that there so much was going on during this time period. And this was also the period of war between Sweden and Poland. And so it makes sense that perhaps she was, I'm speculating, I don't know this for a fact at all, that she was some sort of child bride to try and unite part of Poland and Sweden, and perhaps that's what it was all about. I'm not sure, that maybe that's why she wound up where she was.
Right. I don't think we mentioned that they determined that at time of death her age was 18.
Right.
Yeah,
And
so she was a young woman. I mean,
she was a very young woman. And
to have all those ailments going on, that's incredible.
right. And what's also interesting is that part of the reason why they know anything about her, because again, like I said, this was not a regular cemetery by any means. There's no markers on any of those graves on the mountain at all, not a one. But in her grave, even though it had been disturbed a few times, there was a headdress and some material that was still on her head. And this is fascinating to me. I didn't even know this was possible, but they actually had silk wrapped in gold and silver threads, which is incredible to me that that's even possible. So she had very elaborate clothing at one point, and her headpiece was extremely valuable and extremely expensive. The idea that she even had silk at all, that silk was extremely rare to get in the 17th century. So she came from some significant wealth, period. But it's sad to me that she got villainized so much. And it makes you wonder, what all did they blame her for? And what kind of amazing craziness was going on at the time where she would be blamed for something horrific and be tormented? Even in death, she was feared. The story and information that we found explained that in the 17th century, vampires were not just looked upon as vampires. They were looked upon as a combination of a zombie and a witch and a vampire. And so so they were actually, there was a belief that even the dirt around these graves could spread this condition or disease to anyone near them. And so they would even extract graves and burn everything. Right. They would mutilate the bones, they would burn the clothes, burn the dirt, burn everything connected, just to free themselves from the fear and panic that this creature could come back to life.
Right. They even mentioned that apparently the vampire virus, or whatever you want to call it, was so infectious that it could contaminate the ground around its grave.
Yes.
And infect other corpses and turn them into vampires.
Right.
Post-mortem.
And what's also fascinating, and I'd never heard this before either. So apparently there was a belief that if the person that was accused of being a vampire died, if they had a mate when they died, there was a belief that they would be able to come back from the grave and impregnate their spouse.
They would visit their significant other, their husband, their wife, right, whoever it may be, and could literally have children.
And create another vampire by that. And it also, like Doug was just saying, they actually believed that they were so infectious that it would spread. So they never allowed these people to be buried anywhere near a regular grave or cemetery. It was just not done. There was such a tremendous fear and panic about the whole thing. It's just amazing that they were singled out so much, and this vampire hysteria was so vast. Right. This field of vampires has been researched for several years now, and they keep finding more and more. And part of what's interesting is they had people they suspected of being vampires, but they also had people that they suspected of being demons. Right. Now, again, this is a time when there's no medical science. So someone with herpes would be considered somebody that had a demon in their body. Someone that had a growth, you know how sometimes people get
a cancerous growth or whatever.
Yeah, that was considered a sign that you could be a demon or a witch.
And that was where the padlock on the toe comes from.
Yes,
that's some way to keep the demon locked inside.
To trap the second soul. Yeah, right. I'm fascinated that they thought there were two souls in a body. That blows me away. I don't think.
But an interesting point is that at some point with Zosha, in the at least two different exhumations
Right.
where she was dug up, somebody undid the padlock.
They think.
Yeah, because
They
when
found
they
it open.
discovered the padlock was open.
This
Now
one,
that doesn't happen normally. Like
right.
when you find an antique padlock and it's locked for good.
Right.
So that suggests that maybe somebody dug her up and tried to get her to rise.
Maybe.
I don't know.
So there was a historian, Dan Jones, that was discussing this, and he said in that time when they were digging them up, if they were to have discovered this padlock being open, that would have caused complete terror, and there would have been complete panic.
Right.
And part of this other part. So we've heard the stories of vampires. We've heard about, they drink the blood of blah, 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 and that sustains their life, and so on and so on. So in this vampire panic, to understand how incredibly vast, so they think they're infectious even in death. They think they can bring their disease and spread it by pregnancy or by just affecting another dead body and bringing it back to life. So they're presenting that zombie idea along with vampires side by side. And then they're treating it also with witchcraft ideas that supposedly they could affect other people even in death by different ways. They could pollute the water, or they could destroy crops. Everything was blamed on these people. Every disaster, every shortcoming, every failment, everything was bad and disgusting on their part. And so they were used as a scapegoat. But what's fascinating, part of the treatment to repel them from you was to drink their blood.
Yeah. So all the farmers and everything would be drinking the proposed vampire's blood.
Yeah.
Which is probably part of the reason why the bodies were exhumed and, to
try more than once.
Yeah.
For people to protect themselves from this.
Which is fascinating because that's a flip of the script right there,
I can't even wrap my brain around it. It's bizarre. The other thing that we were learning that's really bizarre too is that apparently if you didn't have a period, if you skipped a period, come on ladies, how many times have you been stressed or just had a weird month and you didn't have your period? You would be killed for that. You were considered a hazard, and you were either possessed by a demon or you were a vampire. And worse yet, if you had a miscarriage, you were considered an affected person, and you would be considered a threat to your community, and you would be terminated. You would be killed.
Oh, real quick, if you guys hear any noise coming from my side of the screen, Gizmo snoring and acting up. But she has been fed and watered before dark, so we should be okay.
Yeah, it's just incredible, some of the ideas that came through in that period. And just to imagine in the 17th century, they didn't realize what was killing people. They didn't realize, the crop problems and the weather had nothing to do with what one person's choices were. And so it's kind of fantastic to think about how much people didn't understand, that knowledge was so limited, and understanding of the world, understanding how climate works, understanding how the blood works in our body,
right,
and just how frail the human body can be and what conditions are there, just health conditions. They're not anything to do with something destructive that would affect other people.
Well, there is validity in the statement that all legends are based off of something real.
Right.
So their fear, though, may have been misguided. Who knows? Maybe there actually was or is something out there.
Right.
That we just aren't aware of.
Right.
There are vampire legends, going all the way back, to the time of Lilith and even before.
Right.
So who knows?
It's just fascinating to me that so many things were blamed on an odd person. Anyone that was unique or different was always a victim and ended up being accused of so many things, but I'm also fascinated that the myths overlapped. I had no idea that vampires were accused of being more zombie-like, or that they were considered like a witch or a demon in some way. That just seems incredible to me that so much was overlapped, because in my upraising and my experience with the legends and stories, they were very separated. And there, even though there were traits that kind of overlapped on some of the monsters that were told about, there wasn't one big monster story that was just all encompassing. So it's fascinating to me that this was considered, this was empirical evidence. If you had anything wrong with your body, you were this or you were that. Right. And it literally, all it took was someone to accuse you of being a vampire and you're done. You were done.
Well, I have heard stories of where vampires were considered, say, like lesser demons.
Oh.
And in fact, Joss Whedon's whole premise of vampires in his Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel series, vampires are lesser demons.
Interesting. Okay.
But but the witch and zombie thing, I mean, I get the comparison because, zombies are the dead, are the undead, so are vampires. I get the comparisons, but there's a big difference between, say, like a voodoo zombie or Night of the Living Dead, and a vampire. There's a big difference. So I get the comparison.
Right, but what I get to is that because of this Countess Elizabeth that murdered so many. I mean, she didn't help matters. Assuming that virgin blood would keep her young and bathing in it, that's a little cuckoo to begin with. But she didn't help the vampire myth by doing that, by making virgins disappear by the hundreds. By the hundreds.
I think it's she has a lot of notoriety in the vampire legends, because her body count is so high.
Oh, sure.
Vlad Tepes, Dracula.
Right.
His body count was extremely high, but he also was in a war-torn area of Turkey and Hungary, and so I think she has more fame from the body count, and because it's very interesting. It's like I understand the concept of consuming blood to sustain yourself.
Right.
Blood is what makes us live, blood and oxygen. But the bathing in it to stay young, I mean, that almost suggests like it's a fountain of youth type of thing.
Right. But I also wonder too, when they talk about the effect of blood and people that are affected by it, and when they're talking about all this blaming that goes on, that supposedly vampires were responsible for all of the destruction of crops and all that, where were all these victims? Where were the people with fang marks or evidence of mutilation that they were eaten or their blood was drained somehow? I mean, where was all that in the 17th century? Where was their proof? Because it doesn't look like they have a lot of proof. It's a lot of speculation and accusations without any basis in reality.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking, this was the late 1700s that Zosha was killed, or we actually don't know if she was killed or not, or whether she died of natural causes.
Right.
They don't honestly know.
Right.
But there wasn't a lot of medical science then. So, it's all based off of superstition and, hearsay.
Right. It's just incredible. But I'm hoping that more will come out of this field of vampires, and that they will find more information. If you're interested in looking it up, the city is called Pienia, and it's spelled Pien with a hyphen, in Poland. And you can look up, there's lots of photographs. I tried to get them to post on the episode, but I wasn't able to do that. There's some fascinating pictures, and there's a lot of information. You can find things on YouTube, and you can find things even with the Washington Post. There's several newspaper companies that did publish information about her particular grave. And
But
if you
again,
just,
she wasn't the only grave. I
no,
mean,
that's what I mean.
there were a number of children's graves that were treated the same way,
right.
with locks on their toes and, some type of vampire or vampiric burial.
And there were restraints across the neck, and then there were several that were mutilated or folded in half or flipped over for some reason. If something, and what was explained that I thought was even more fascinating. So after someone died, if anything bad happened, it was blamed on the person that just died. And so, especially if someone had been put in this area of, the reject cemetery, as it were, if you were rejected by the village you were in, they would put you in the reject cemetery. And then if anything bad happened after you died, then they would go back to your grave, they would dig you up and check on you. They would check on you and see if anything was different with your body. And in many cases, they would flip you over or fold you in half and do something to keep you from rising again. Yeah. And that's where more restraints were added, which I find fascinating that they kept messing with the dead bodies.
Yeah, I find it a bit entertaining that the mindset was, oh, if we flip them over in their graves, they won't figure out how to dig up. That's interesting.
It's kind of bizarre, but it's hard to wrap my brain around, because in this day and age, there's so much understanding that we have about basic things, and it's kind of bizarre to think that there was so much misinformation that was believed to be truth.
Right. Well, I mean, there was even one child's grave where the body had been dug up and it had been flipped over so that it was facing, the dirt.
Ground. Yeah.
But it was also, he was dismembered at the waist. So it was and they don't know where the top half of him went to.
No.
They haven't found him yet. And so it's only his bottom torso and his legs that are flipped upside down in the grave and was recovered. Very interesting.
There was another one. It was a pregnant woman that was buried, and there was someone buried next to her, but the grave was empty.
Right.
And again, like Doug said,
that's one that got out.
I don't know. And there's several children's graves, and I find that so fascinating too, that they would accuse a child of being a vampire. We know in today's day and age that children get all kinds of childhood diseases without any way to prevent polio or diphtheria or the mumps. There's tons of childhood diseases, even rosacea, which only lasts a couple weeks and goes away. But any discoloration was something people would freak out about and go absolutely nuts over.
Well, there are some parents who might say that children suck the life out of them.
I guess so. Yeah, I did feel that way a couple of times. I didn't have any sleep for years, I swear. I used to say I'll sleep when I'm dead, because I did not sleep when I had kids.
Yeah.
You know that morning where you're laying in bed and your kid holds your eyelid open and says, "Are you awake, Mom?" That happened to me more than a couple times. So I wanted to continue the conversation about the amazing history and lineage of vampires and where they progressed. And I'm fascinated that the vampire stories that I grew up with are mild and pale by comparison to what came out of the 17th century.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It just boggles my mind. The first time I ever saw the Grimm fairy tales, the original German fairy tales, they're terrifying. They're incredibly scary.
They were supposed to be.
The stuff that I grew up with, the Disney version of all that stuff was so bland and calm by comparison. It just freaks me out. That's so amazing. But what's even more amazing to me is that even after all these generations and all of this evolution of knowledge and medical science, we still have people that, as of 2022, identify as being a vampire in the United States.
Yeah.
They're serious. They believe that. And in articles that I've been reading, so there are people that they don't use their teeth, they don't bite, but they actually have arranged meetings where they go and get a couple tablespoons of blood every month from a willing donor.
Yeah.
And there are vampire clubs and vampire cultures, and they're called fang gangs. Fang gangs.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I have, I've spent some time in New Orleans, and I have spent time in vampire bars. It's an entire culture. It does exist.
So tell us about the vampire bars that you attended.
It's funny, but the one that I went to is in the French Quarter, and it's very much like a normal bar. That's the first time that I tried absinthe. So that was very interesting. But yeah, it's just the culture there, and it's part of the woodwork. There are tons of vampire stories out of Louisiana.
It seems like that's a very entrenched area for those kinds of stories. I've never been, but it does seem to be very rich in history and information.
Well, it is the oldest city in the United States.
Is that right?
Yeah, it was because it was a French colony.
Oh, that's right.
Long before the United States came around.
That's right. I forget that.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, this culture, there's actual vampire conventions. It's interesting, but there's actual studies in some of the colleges about the vampire culture and what people are doing in it and why.
Right.
And the little bit that I've seen, I haven't seen a whole lot on TV. I've read more than I've seen. But it has a culture of sexuality connected with it, and it has a culture of people that feel like they might have something that's in decline in their own blood, and they feel like unless they have someone else's blood, they won't be okay.
Right.
They actually feel a surge of energy when they drink someone else's blood, and they go to the trouble to vet people that they're going to drink from to make sure that they're disease free, that they're clean. Everything about them is checked. So they're not doing it haphazardly and just for a savage joy of weirdness.
Yeah, they're not attacking anybody. Yeah.
Right. It's not a violent thing whatsoever. It's literally done in a very calm manner, which, I used to have a tablespoon of honey every week to help me with my allergies. And it almost makes me feel like if that's what someone believes, if they believe that having a tablespoon or so of someone else's blood is going to make them feel better, and mentally they believe it, they feel it physically, they feel a physical response. What do you say to that?
Originally the theory was that probably these people who felt they needed blood, they may be anemic, some type of vitamin deficiency that's in blood. But a lot of these vampires have been tested, and they're not. So they're getting something else from it that we aren't aware of. Now maybe it's a placebo. I don't know.
I don't know, because they're very adamant that they feel better, and that they actually have several people have been willing participants in studies, and they've said their whole life that they struggled with their energy level. They struggled with some form of lack of vitality in their life. And so when this opportunity presented itself, or when they discovered that they had an option to drink blood and try it, it solved these problems, that they felt revitalized, they had energy again, or in some cases for the first time. And so they believe that it's like a medicine for them almost.
Right. But, all of that, as far as like the American or European vampire stories go, it's that none of that is supernatural. None of that is paranormal.
Right.
There are all kinds of vampire stories, especially if you look at the Asian vampires. They don't drink blood.
What?
They drink life force. They drink your energy.
Oh, wow.
They're
literally like a psychic vampire.
Same kind of thing. You
Wow.
know,
That's wow. Okay.
right?
I
You
did
know,
not know that.
and there are some theories, like in some of the movies or in some of the vampire style role playing games and things like that, where the Asian vampire sects um, look down upon the European and American ones because drinking blood's disgusting, in their opinion. You know,
Interesting.
so I mean, it's not across the board that they're all the same.
Interesting.
Yeah,
That is amazing. I did not know that.
yeah.
See, I know very little about this stuff. That's why the research has been really fun, because I'm learning stuff I've never heard before. And what is that famous movie called about vampires that's very, very old?
Nosferatu.
Yeah. So thank you. I had to have Kat say that for me in the last episode we talked about it.
Yeah,
I just can't say that worth a doodle. But anyway, what's a fascinating thing to me is that no matter where you start in the vampire interest level, no matter how you're introduced to this legend and these stories, it absolutely is captivating.
right.
There's so much about it that has been enveloped in the cultures and all over the world, not
Right.
just here, everywhere. And it just keeps going and going and going. And so it really makes me fascinated with where exactly did it actually start, and where's that crumb of truth that's in all these amazing stories? Where did we begin? Because if just going to the 17th century is a scary, bumpy ride. I mean, that's devastating. That there was so much, people were brutalized after death repeatedly because they were thought to be the cause of everything that was bad. And maybe in some ways those villagers were regaining their power that they had lost,
Mhm.
because here they had no food, they had centuries of horrible weather, terrible crops, disease. I mean, they were dying out. There
Mhm.
were big areas, not just from the Black Death, but from other things that happened, big climate changes. And who knows, maybe there was an asteroid that hit the planet, and that's why they had a small ice age again. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of unanswered questions, but there was a lot of struggle, and there wasn't much technology. There was very few advancements in technology for many generations, many hundreds of years. People were using basic tools and basic things. There was very little knowledge that expanded until things developed in the Renaissance. And even then, it was a battle to regain human thought and get people to think outside their fears. Fear
Right.
was so large. Fear of everything different and strange was vast and powerful. Fear is a very powerful emotion. But it's interesting that here's this subject matter that is terrifying. And no matter what generation you're in, it still captivates you. It's still
Right.
fascinating.
Well, an interesting little thing about the original movie Nosferatu.
Mhm.
Um, you know, that's not the slick, pretty, sexually driven vampire that we know today.
Right.
That's actually, Nosferatu is the name of that style of vampire.
Okay.
And if you look at him, he's far more demonic than than like the Bela Lugosi,
Right.
and
Oh,
his
very much
opera
so.
tux and cape. you know,
Right. He had very strange looking teeth. He had a
right?
very strange looking
But
head.
right, but
Everything
what's
about him was
interesting,
creepy. Yeah.
what's interesting about that movie is that that actor who played Nosferatu,
Hmm.
I can't remember what the character's name is, but he's a count or whatever.
Right.
But that actor's name, I believe, was Max Schreck.
Okay.
Okay.
That's
There is absolutely no record of that actor. And so it is proposed that he was a real vampire.
oh, good Lord. Really?
Yeah. Yeah,
I
that's
just heard that.
that's movie lore. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
there's absolutely no record of that actor.
Well, it was probably a stage name for one, because that was common and still is to have a stage name. But yeah, that's amazing. That's incredible. So I'm just curious where we're going to go from here, because this development and just what you were saying about Asian vampires, I'd never heard that before. That's incredible. So I wonder what other vampire cultures do. If they're stealing life or robbing something for energy to live on, what else do they do? I mean, they're demons, they're witches, they're zombies. They're all of these different creatures massed into one. That's a lot.
Yeah.
It's an incredible creature you're talking about. That's a lot of power.
Pretty soon we're going to find out that they're boy bands and pop stars.
I think that's amazing. I don't know. I think we need to be curious about this stuff, and I think it's good to research and find out things. And I think it was a really cool perspective to actually sit and see the fear mongering and how crazy it got, and how that scared me more than the reality that it could exist.
Well, but that's the whole thing. It's like that mentality hasn't changed.
No, it hasn't.
Just the villain has changed.
Yeah.
We still deal with that today.
Yeah.
Across the world. Something's different. People don't like it. They villainize it.
Right. This is true. This is very true. Well, I'm glad that we got to talk about all this stuff, because I'm fascinated with what is constantly being discovered and things that are showing up. And I love archaeology. I love the discovery of where we were, because I don't think that we're ever going to get better until we figure out where we came from. Yeah. I think we need very desperately to keep track of our past and be close to it. It makes a lot of sense to me. It makes a lot of sense to me that people didn't understand what was happening. They looked for the closest thing that was weird to blame. And we shouldn't do that anymore. We should be more careful about when we cast blame when we're scared. But we still do it. I think you're right, Doug. I think we still do it. Definitely. Well, I want to say thank you to Doug for coming and helping me discuss all this. It's been an interesting week, and I would love to hear comments. And I just want to make sure and let people know that they can definitely get in touch with me, and you can write to me at holleyspandorium@gmail.com. And let me see, I have one other thing I can throw in here. Okay.
Definitely like and subscribe.
Yes, please. Oh, thank you for remembering that. I forget to say that, and Jay reminds me so diligently. So thank you, Doug. Yeah, it takes just a second, you guys, and it really does help me. I know this sounds silly and goofy, but just like the video. If you don't want to subscribe, I don't care. I would love it if you did, but if you don't feel like it, that's okay. Please,
it costs nothing.
It doesn't cost
anything. It's a big thing.
And it helps. And that way someone that's curious about things can find me and enjoy the video too. Well, this is Holly and Doug saying thank you so much for listening and watching. And we'll look forward to the next time we get to visit and talk about something spooky. Thanks again.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Holly's Pandorium. If you have stories to share, you can find me on hollyspandorium.com, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also listen on Spotify and our wonderful Metal Cross Radio at radioking.com. Thanks again for listening.